So this is Thursday, the 15th of July, 2021, and this is part A of the Kudilar television channel being broadcast only on the internet. That is the platform limitation. But essentially what we conduct is world exclusive diagnosis of Fleet Street. Fleet Street being the collection of the print papers, also known as the British papers, but they're actually referring to the papers that are printed from addresses in London in the, within quotation marks, UK. And on this front page of this New European, which is a weekly, published on Thursdays, or is it Thursday, the 15th of July to Wednesday, the 21st of July. And this one is has got a front page. Byline to Alistair Campbell. On the rise and coming fall of a dangerous new brand of political philosophy. Sadopopulism. It's like sadomasochism. And that's the sadopopulist with his sadomasochist. Kind of image. Now, Alistair Campbell is not far from, or is not a stranger to sadopopulism or sadomasochism. From the mid-1990s until the end of the century, Campbell was the sadomasochist Tony Blair's main propaganda kind of front. And according to many contemporary observers, Tony Blair's sadomasochist, sadistic propaganda line was worked out, scripted by Alistair Campbell himself. So he should know what sadopopulism is from the inside, let's say, because he was resident where the target of his sadopopulist line today is resident, the congenital liar Boris Johnson. And there is on the front page of the Financial Crimes, there is this similar kind of state of affairs being scenarioed. MI5 chief details Afghanistan terror risk. Now, MI5 is not MI6. MI5 is the domestic spying operation in the UK. So the fact that MI5 chief talking about Afghanistan terror risk and not the MI6, which is the foreign spying outlet and operation on behalf of the British state, is significant. Not least because that actually illustrates the contradiction in the policy and the narrative and the agenda being pursued by the Boris Johnson fronted cabal. Boris Johnson being the congenital liar, according to the woman who had been for 3 years or 4 years the chief diplomat for France in the UK. Sunak's demands for belt tightening threaten to strain cabinet relations. Now, that is the internal political line that the Financial Crimes is peddling there. Now, what that means is that there is contradictions and conflicts, serious fundamental disagreements on the facts of what is happening in the generally referred to thing called the economy. The NATO withdrawal is being referred to, is a reference to the UK and the USA et al. Leaving Afghanistan. So MI chief fears terror risk created by Afghan exit. And this is written by a woman called Helen Worrell. That's the byline, at least, if not the whole content necessarily. And she is being described as defense and security editor. What do these people edit? That is a tag that is deliberately dishonestly given. MI6 is allowed to risk that terrorists will re-establish training camps in Afghanistan and seek a propaganda advantage as coalition forces leave the country, said the Director General of the Domestic Intelligence Service. Delivering his annual threat assessment yesterday, Ken McCallum said MI5 was shifting to a new and challenging mode of counter-terrorism in Afghanistan, in which the UK, US, and other allies have neither the advantages nor the risks of troops on the ground now. That shows that MI5 has now become the MI6 as well. We shall check if MI6 still exists as a platform. Last week, Prime Minister Johnson announced the majority of British forces had left Afghanistan ahead of September's departure deadline for the withdrawal of all US military personnel. Joe Biden, US President, chose the 20-year anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which prompted the Afghan deployment, to end what he called America's longest war. Now, what does it mean? What have they actually done in terms of the physical engagement in activities that constitute war? Because if even before the completion, the physical completion of the withdrawal of Afghan and what is now called NATO forces, if even before that has been completed, Afghan Taliban and others of the similar bent have established, according to their admission, the admission in the Financial Crimes and the MI5 man, their units and their points of propaganda, etc. Commenting on the current instability, McCallum said while the military campaign had dismantled Al-Qaeda's infrastructure, terrorists had a record of exploiting ungoverned spaces. That is stupid. It's not just terrorists. It's the so-called not terrorists who do the same thing. Ungoverned spaces is a concept that is not peculiar to or unique to terrorists. In the case of Afghanistan, you might imagine that if pockets of ungoverned space open up, some terrorist groups might seek, for example, to re-establish some training facilities there, as we have seen in the past, he said. The Director General, who was speaking at MI5's headquarters in London, added the departure of NATO forces might inspire terrorists on British soil. Now, how does that work? It must surely be likely that extremist groups of various sorts, include the UK-based groupings that have no meaningful connections themselves to Afghanistan, will seek to portray this to their own adherents and potentially to those they are seeking to interest or recruit or radicalize as a victory for extremist Islam. What is extremist Islam? This McCallum piece, as reported by the Financial Crimes, has created a scenario that is a parallel scenario. It's a fantasy, unreal scenario based on the perceptions and his kind of own distorted view about extremist Islam. Where are these extremist people? Where in society or in the world are the extremists? And what do they do? Where do they get their extremist inspirations? Revealing that MI5 has doubled its resources to deal with state-based threats, which range from Russia's use of an armed agent in Salisbury 3 years ago to intellectual property theft and online disinformation. He said that increasingly, members of the public were falling victim to state activity. Given half a chance, hostile actors will short-circuit years of patient British research or investment. This is happening at a scale and it affects us all. UK jobs, UK public services, UK futures. McCallum described the high prevalence of teenagers being drawn into right-wing extremism. A third of all late-stage attack plots prevented by British intelligence agencies in the past 4 years were from the right-wing terrorists, with one case involving a child aged just 13, he said. What they say by right-wing is those Christian and other non-Islamic groups. That's what they mean by right-wing. They don't want to give those ones religious or national or cultural identities, which for the part played by the Financial Crimes is a deliberately anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim kind of agenda and narrative and use of language or misuse of language or abuse of language. And the German spy chief, the counterpart of the MI6 spy chief, is warning of cyber attacks on Bundestag election. And there is a rare piece about the judiciary. Poland rules against European Union on judiciary. We shall come to that in a second, just in a second. Warsaw, that is Poland, court rejects call by Brussels to obey orders on legal system reforms. Now, the Polish state, although it's a member of the European Union, is a pseudo populist state, as the New European piece on the cover of this week's edition says about Boris Johnson being a pseudo populist. Poland's constitution has ruled that the country does not have, well, reading again, Poland's constitutional court has ruled that the country does not have to obey or orders from the European Union's top court relating to its, that is Poland's, contested judicial overhaul, escalating a feud between Poland and Brussels, that is the European Union, over the rule of law. The Polish Constitutional Court ruling caps a 5-year battle over wide-ranging changes carried out by Poland's conservative nationalist Law and Justice Party, which give politicians sweeping powers over the judiciary. Those changes sparked legal challenges from Brussels, which regards the overhaul as a fundamental threat to judicial independence in the European Union's fifth biggest state. One of the changes introduced was a new chamber for disciplining judges, which the Court of Justice of the European Union last year ordered Poland to suspend. Now that is a significant state of deterioration in the concept of what has so far been internationally accepted as the rule of law in the context of the separation of powers. The constitutional arrangement in those states and jurisdictions where the separation of powers has included guaranteed independence of the judiciary from the executive in charge of the government of the day, in the region, in the country, in the state. So, for example, there is the executive, which is the government made of whatever the government in that country is for the time being made of. So the executive, one part, the judiciary, another part, and parliament, another part. So these are the three parts, but there can be other parts as well. But let's say these are the three parts. So if the Polish Constitutional Court rules the judges should be open to being judged by another forum, another platform, then that is a departure from the existing kind of set of parts of the state. The judiciary is one part, independent of the government, that is the executive, and of the parliament. So judicial autonomy and sovereignty has been allowed to exist so far in the constitution of the jurisdictions of the countries where the rule of law and constitutional arrangements, including the various powers, separate powers, that is separation of powers, have been allowed to exist, at least theoretically, if not necessarily always in practice. Because in countries where there is notional, that is theoretical, only in the name separation of powers. For example, many of the countries in the subcontinent, in Asia, including Bangladesh, the judiciary may appear to be enjoying separate independent status, but in effect, in practice, may be brazenly open to abuse and manipulation by the executive, which goes on to corrupt the judiciary's behavior to the extent that the judiciary becomes, in effect, a stooge of the executive, carrying out the corrupt practices and agenda of the corrupt executive. So what is happening in Poland is definitely even worse than what has happened in Bangladesh for the last many years. That is to say that the separation of powers is now being openly denied by Poland, or the Polish stance, the Polish so-called constitutional court. Whereas in Bangladesh, there is a persisting pretense that there is still separation of powers and the judiciary is independent of the executive, which is not the case. In India, the judiciary is as bad as it is in Pakistan. So, separation of powers is being preserved only in pretense in Pakistan, in India, and in Bangladesh. But in Poland, it is not bothering. Poland is not even bothering to maintain the pretense of separation of powers. So that's the issue between the European Union and the Court of Justice of the EU, CJEU, that ordered Poland last year to suspend its brazen kind of denial of the separation of powers. And what is happening with that clash between Poland and the EU on the state and the status of the judiciary is in fact exposing to scrutiny the actual corruption inherent in, let's say in the case of the quote UK, the judiciary, which is in our language, it's a racist, corrupt judiciary. And it's not just at the Supreme Court level, it's not just at the Court of Appeal level, not in the High Court level. It is inclusive of the lowest and the most numerous components of the judicial corruption and racism. The tribunals, the county courts, the crown courts, and the magistrates' courts. And when there is no separation of powers in effect, that is to say, when there is no real recourse, no real remedy through judicial process against executive corruption, wrongdoing, and racism, executive meaning the state, central government departments, local councils, and the regional assembly. For example, in the case of the metropolis of London, is the Greater London Assembly. So there is no recourse, there is no remedy against executive corruption, wrongdoing. Now it is a matter of principle. There is no remedy even in principle. Now this stress that I'm making on principle is intended to emphasize the difference between individual and institutional. And it is a point I'm making about the institutional. And that is even before beginning to examine the individual, that is the persons sitting in the court as judges, members of the judiciary. They themselves, even where there is the actual operation of the separation of powers principle or the doctrine of the separation of powers, the well-established theory that is substantiated by practice, the doctrine of separation of powers may exist in full, but only in name, because when it comes to the actual application of that principle, that concept of separation of powers, objectively applying the universal principles of fairness and neutrality by individual appliers of the principles, that is to say the judges, if the judges themselves are racist, if they are dishonest, if they are themselves corrupt, then no matter how, quote, solid and substantial the separation of powers doctrine may be, in practice it may mean nothing for the benefit of those who seek or who are supposedly assured a remedy by the commentators and the protectors and the defenders and the describers and the narrators of the existence of the constitutional concept of or doctrine of separation of powers. So what is happening in Poland is kind of smashing to bits all the pretensions and the doctrines. And if the EU is continued to be denied by Poland, then Poland is going to be making a stand against the collective policy that has so far prevailed, insofar as the ministers, as the members of the European Union as members have been concerned. There is nothing to do with the actual comments that the proponents of the Brexit ideology and agenda have made, because they have said, and they continue to say in Britain, that Brexit means that, or Brexit was intended to mean, as they say, our laws, our rights and our laws. Now, when they say our laws, they are not talking about laws that had existed before the coming into being of the European Union or of the EEC. They are talking about the laws that actually have been introduced into the framework of the membership of individual states of the European Union. And those laws and regulations, as expressed in the directives in the case of the European Union, are almost without any exception laws that break the existing or pre-existing oppressive legal pretexts in the member state concerned. For example, in the UK, the legislation even after the departure of the UK from Brexit, from the EU via Brexit, there is no right to freedom of expression. Think about that. After all the decades of the membership of the EU, the UK was allowed to continue without recognizing the right to freedom of expression. There is no right to freedom of expression. And those who pretend, like Alistair Campbell in the New European and others, to be against Brexit, even they have been silent on the absence of the right to protest and right to freedom of expression. So, despite the various suggestions that the EU was the source of liberating the laws to give give expression to international and objective rights to protest, right to freedom of speech, etc. Even the EU was not effecting or affecting member states' behavior, which continued to be and continues to be to suppress freedom of expression. And that has been about ordinary people, the many, the citizens, not about the parts of the state. And the biggest significant part outside of the executive is, of course, the judiciary. And that has been now sabotaged in Poland. Until this confrontation ends, the sabotage prevails. There is going to be a decision today about the Poland and the EU confrontation. But the prospect of this confrontation being resolved today is almost nil. Okay, the piece about regulators, competition regulators, sharpening their claws is, of course, overhyping the tendency, but we shall come to that in a later part of this edition. Now, this heading is completely long overdue and absolutely true. Whether the contents underneath is bearing this out is another matter. Which says that lower economic growth does not mean less human happiness. We shall come to that in detail, and at this point, we say that that is absolutely true, and that is contrary to the main kind of narrative by the capitalists, because they keep saying that growth equals human happiness and, of course, achievement. Now, that doesn't. For a start, what they say, and they have been saying, growth is destruction of the universal resources that belong to everyone on the planet. And especially they've been destroying the planet itself. And capitalism has been the kind of impunity given to crooks to loot the planet without any accountability to the absolute majority of the planet's owners and the planet itself, human and animal and plant resources on the planet. And this Robert Shrimsley, who is a crypto proponent or promoter of the conservative ideology, is given the opinion about the Tory culture war. This Robert Shrimsley, like his father, is a conservative, and he's doing too much of maneuvering and manipulation and twisting in his article to hide his conservative kind of leanings. And the piece by Brooke Masters about competition is also overhyping. And there is a rare admission the only one on this page of the financial crimes today, Thursday, the 15th of July 2021, which is headed Asylum Pushbacks Shame the European Union and the UK, and it's by Tony Barber. This last paragraph says the European Union and the UK pride themselves on upholding human rights and the rule of law. Remember the rule of law about Poland and the separation of powers we discussed in the past 20 minutes. But their harsh, haphazard treatment of refugees and migrants tells a different story. Pushbacks and sending asylum seekers to distant lands are methods unworthy of prosperous, civilized nations. My goodness. The Tony Barber is even using the word civilized. So the countries in Africa and Asia are not civilized. Well, many of the countries in Africa and Asia, or let's say many of the states in Africa and Asia, are controlled by gangs of criminals, literally gangs of criminals, who are only in power in controlling positions because within the accepted boundaries and borders and frameworks that do not exist, sufficiently resourceful and powerful groups and individuals with capacity to diagnose these criminals out of any legitimate claim and then to kick them out of power. Now that is a morass. That is a state of political death that prevails and dominates across big demographic parts of the continents of Africa and Asia, which is part of the reason why so many people of African and Asian origins and backgrounds are desperate to leave those places, which amount to starvation, hunger, and famine as the dominant experience. So Tony Barber is saying that the European Union and the UK pride themselves as being civilized. I mean, when did he actually examine the evidence that supported, that he justified such a pride, such a claim, such a boast, such an assertion on the part of the European Union and the UK? As it must be pointed out, the UK today, 15th of July 2021, has got anything between 20 and 30 million people in low income, UK standard. That is to say, UK prices, current prices. So that is just, it's over 1/3 of the total population of the UK today. So if the people are in low income and many are in no income effectively, then they are not in civilization. They are not in civilization. And to them, even the slightest kind of statement that a new person in poverty is being added to the list next to themselves is the most ready trigger to hate the new listed person. That's the paradox. And that paradox is part of the problem intentionally created and perpetrated by those in power. And those who are supposedly watching those in power. For example, the so-called opposition parties. This is a commentary today. This is a commentary about Britain today, and is being made today based on the evidence of the contents of the newspaper of today's day. So it's not like being made later. It's being made now. And when we say that we are doing the exclusive world diagnosis or exclusive world diagnosis of Fleet Street, we are literally meaning that. So that is the financial crimes. And here is a very kind of telling piece on the Daily Mail, written by Nazir Afzal. Now, Nazir Afzal was a Crown Prosecution Service prosecutor, and he's described as former Chief Crown Prosecutor for Northwest England. And his piece is headed by this heading: if the Yard's dame of disaster doesn't quit, she must be decommissioned. And he's saying, Nazir Afzal, what an unlucky police commissioner Cressida Dick has proved to be. She has suffered a litany of catastrophes during her time as head of the Metropolitan Police. And to hear her tell it, not one has been her fault. No, the fact is that her failure to take responsibility is the root of all her problems, because she will not accept blame or set an example as a leader. She has lost the confidence of both the public and her own officers. Her mantras seem to be, it's not my responsibility, Gab. Nothing to do with me. She is weak, indecisive, and on the evidence of her own record, incompetent. The time is long past for her to fall on her sword. Yet astonishingly, reports yesterday claimed that she intends next month to attempt to extend her 5-year fixed contract, which is due to expire in April. Recent calls for her to resign have been brushed away on the basis that her tenure was due to come to an end next year regardless. Now we know she reportedly intends to continue running the force. A thought that deeply concerns me, says Nazir Afzal. If Cousins had been properly investigated and dismissed, as he would have certainly have been, by most employers, Sarah Everard might well be alive today. Yet that is far from her only disgrace. The errors of her tenure come thick and fast. There has already been another major blunder since Cousins appeared at the Old Bailey on Friday. Scenes at Wembley Stadium on Sunday shamed the nation as hundreds, probably thousands of football supporters without tickets for the Euro Euro final stormed the gates. After brawling with stewards and overcoming the pitifully inadequate police presence, they gained access to the stands. After the match, as the crowd tried to leave, we saw more outbreaks of violence and chaos. The police were powerless to prevent this because they were not adequately prepared. Senior officers can hardly blame a lack of proper warning. Talk of storming the turnstiles had been all over the social media at the weekend. It's one more example of dreadful leadership and inexplicable decisions by the commissioner. And it's one for which Britain will pay a high price. Many believe that the collapse of security at Wembley, together with the vile racism directed at some players, have effectively ended our hopes of hosting the World Cup in 2030. We now know the final itself came close to being called off. What an international humiliation that would have been. And Nazir Afzal goes on. Right now, thousands of officers are struggling to do their jobs under the most trying conditions since the last World War. They cannot cope if their boss is floundering too. For everyone's sake, Cressida Dick must go now. Will she? Is the question now. We look at the and the Times is actually running a front page headline that vindicates what I have been saying. I am not the only one who must have been saying this, but this is what I have been saying on the record on these broadcasts. That right from the beginning in 2020, when it was officially announced that COVID-19 had been found in Britain, the various so-called actions by the government, fronted by the congenital liar Boris Johnson, have contained contradictions, to say the least.